a millionaire spotted a poor girl staring at a billboard with his picture on it. As he approached her, she suddenly exclaimed, "Why did you let me and my mother starve for 12 years?" The city pulsed with a rhythm of its own, a ceaseless hum of life moving in sync with blinking neon lights and the soft vibration of passing cars. The glass facade of Smith Technologies towered above the streets, pristine and cold, its edges reflecting the remnants of a fading sunset. The air smelled of damp asphalt and the faint tang of exhaust fumes, mingling with the distant aroma of street vendors selling roasted chestnuts and coffee from makeshift carts. Inside, beyond the revolving doors and polished marble, Arthur Smith was a man encased in precision. His world was carved out of deadlines, data, and deals, a life that left no room for distractions. His time was counted in seconds, and his interactions were measured in terms of gain and loss. A handshake was a contract, a nod, a conclusion. Emotions were impractical, mere obstacles in the relentless pursuit of success. As he descended the last flight of steps leading out of the building, his presence was acknowledged in subtle, automatic ways. Guards straightened their postures, a chauffeur opened the car door with a practiced gesture, and an assistant whispered last-minute updates about board decisions. He barely heard them. His mind had already moved on to the next task, the next acquisition, the next move in a game only he seemed to understand. And then he saw her. She stood near the curb, a small, unmoving figure, dwarfed by the towering LED screen above. His own face flickered on the massive display, a moment frozen in high definition. Sharp suit, controlled expression, the face of a man who had mastered the art of detachment. The girl, no older than 10 or 11, was thin, her clothes threadbare, too light for the evening cold. Her hair was tangled, curling unevenly around her small face, and her hands were stuffed into the pockets of a coat 2 sizes too big. But what struck him was her stillness. She wasn't begging, wasn't looking for pity or coins tossed absent-mindedly by passers-by. She just stood there, staring up at his face on the screen, with an intensity that unsettled him. Arthur hesitated. He had encountered all kinds of people in his career, powerful men who thrived on deception, competitors who masked ambition with politeness, investors who could change the course of industries with a single nod. But this was different. This was a child. He turned slightly, the movement automatic, his body already preparing to step into his car, into familiar certainty. But something stopped him, something irrational and insistent. Instead, he walked toward her. She didn't flinch when his shadow stretched across the pavement. Up close, he could see the sharp angles of her face, the way her cheekbones jutted just a little too much, the way her lips were cracked from the cold. When she turned her head to look at him, her gaze was unreadable, too sharp for a child, too guarded for innocence. "You've been standing here a while," he said, his voice measured, the way he spoke in negotiations. The girl tilted her head slightly, considering him, as if assessing whether he was worth speaking to. "You like the screen?" he asked, following her gaze upward, feigning casualness. Her lips parted, but instead of an answer, she gave him something else entirely. "Why did you let my mother and me starve?" Arthur's breath caught, an unexpected blow landing squarely in his chest. For a moment, he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. The words were simple and direct, but they carried something sharp, something that cut through the layers of detachment he had built over decades. He blinked, searching her face for context, for a mistake. The response died in his throat. The girl's expression didn't waver. She wasn't crying, wasn't pleading. She wasn't even angry in the way he might have expected. There was only a quiet fury, controlled and restrained, as if she had carried those words inside her for so long that they had lost their heat, but none of their weight. Arthur exhaled slowly, steadying himself, reaching for logic in a situation that didn't seem to have any. "There must be a mistake," he started carefully. Her small shoulders squared. No mistake. He's you, right? The little girl pointed to the big screen above. He was used to dealing with crises, but nothing in his decades of negotiating hostile takeovers or diffusing corporate disasters had prepared him for this conversation with this girl on this street, beneath the cold gaze of his own image towering above them. A rush of fragmented thoughts flooded his mind, memories clashing against reason. Who was she? Who was her mother? Why was she saying these things? Arthur Smith had spent 12 years searching for something he thought he had lost forever. And now, something had found him first. The streetlights flickered as the wind swept through the avenues, carrying with it the muffled hum of an evening city in motion. Pedestrians passed in a blur of conversations, laughter, and the occasional honk from impatient drivers stuck in traffic. Somewhere, a street musician played a melancholic tune on an old violin, its notes thin against the restless air. Life moved around them, oblivious, as Arthur stood motionless, the girl's words ringing in his ears like a distant, persistent echo. Why did you let my mother and me starve? His body registered the cold before his mind caught up. A late autumn breeze cut through his tailored coat, but it was nothing compared to the ice settling in his veins. He had been prepared for negotiations, board meetings, power plays. Not this. Not a child with his face in her eyes and resentment in her voice. Arthur knelt down, his movements deliberate. The concrete beneath him was rough, the city's chill seeping through his slacks. Face to face, the girl seemed even smaller than before, her features delicate but worn in a way that no child should be. She did not flinch, did not look away. Instead, she held his gaze, defiant, waiting. His throat felt tight. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if debating whether or not he deserved an answer. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her coat, gripping it as though anchoring herself. "Lily," she said finally. "Lily." He let the name settle, turning it over in his mind. It felt foreign, unfamiliar, yet something about it left an ache in his chest, a whisper of recognition he couldn't place. Arthur exhaled slowly. "Lily," he repeated, testing the weight of it. "Who is your mother?" The flicker of hesitation was brief, but present. Then, her chin lifted slightly, her lips parted, and she said a name. Grace. It wasn't just the word. It was the way she said it. Steady, as if she had spoken it 1,000 times before. But there was something else, something fragile beneath her defiance. The world narrowed, sound dulled, and for a brief, agonizing second, Arthur forgot how to breathe. He knew that name better than his own. It was the name of every regret he carried, the name that had lived in the spaces between his ribs for 12 years, the name he had whispered into the dark when the search turned up empty, when every lead dissolved into nothing, the name that had once been his future before it became his ghost. His pulse roared in his ears, but Lily only watched, measuring him, as though waiting to see what he would do with this newfound truth. "Your mother." His voice came out quieter than he intended, edged with something raw. "Grace, are you sure?" Lily gave him a look that made him feel like the biggest fool in the world. "You didn't even know her name?" she asked, unimpressed. "No," he said quickly, shaking his head, trying to ground himself. "No, I knew her. He stopped, inhaling sharply. "I loved her." The words remained unspoken, caught somewhere between his lungs and his pride. Lily crossed her arms, shifting her weight to one side. "Well, she didn't know that," she said flatly. "She thought you forgot about us." Arthur's stomach twisted. "That's not true." Her eyebrows raised slightly, unimpressed by his defense. "Then where were you?" The question landed like a blow. His mind spun, grasping for explanations. He had spent years searching. He had hired the best private investigators, followed every lead until they turned to dust. He had never stopped looking, had never stopped wanting to find her, But standing here, with Lily's unforgiving gaze pinned on him, none of that mattered. Because Grace never knew, because Lily believed she had been abandoned. "I looked for her," Arthur said, his voice quieter now, steadier. "For years. I never stopped." Lily didn't blink. "Then you didn't look hard enough." The words sliced cleanly through him. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that she had no idea how much he had tried, how much it had cost him, how many nights he had lain awake wondering if Grace was safe, if she was alive. But none of that would make a difference to the child standing before him. Arthur studied her, the way her small hands fisted into the sleeves of her coat, the way her jaw tightened like she was trying not to shake. She had grown up believing she wasn't wanted. She had lived a life where he had been a villain. Arthur let out a slow breath, forced himself to unclench his fists. "I want to see her," he said carefully. Lily tilted her head, studying him like she wasn't sure if he was worth the effort. "Why?" "Because I need to," he admitted. "Because I have questions. And because—" He hesitated, then met her gaze fully. "Because I think I deserve to hear the truth too." Something flickered across Lily's face. A quiet storm of emotions, hesitation, a sliver of something uncertain. She let the silence stretch, long enough that he wondered if she would walk away. Then finally she nodded. "But on my terms." Arthur blinked. "Your terms?" "You follow me," she said simply, "and you don't talk unless I say you can." A small, unexpected laugh caught in his throat, escaping before he could stop it. He hadn't laughed, really laughed, in years. Lily narrowed her eyes. "What?" "Nothing." He straightened, rolling his shoulders back. "Lead the way." She glanced at him once more before turning on her heel, walking ahead with the confidence of someone who had always had to navigate the world alone. Arthur followed. Every step forward felt like stepping towards something irreversible, something that had been waiting for him all along. The city unfolded before them, shifting in tone and texture as they moved away from the towering glass buildings and manicured sidewalks of Arthur's world. The air changed, thickening with the scent of fried dough and grilled meat from food carts stationed along the streets, mixing with the sharp tang of exhaust fumes. The further they walked, the more the city seemed to press in. Tighter alleyways, narrower roads, buildings packed shoulder to shoulder, their facades worn from time and neglect. Arthur barely noticed the uneven pavement beneath his polished shoes before, but now he felt every crack, every broken piece of asphalt. He had spent years moving through cities just like this, but always in cars with tinted windows, always above the mess of real life, always apart from it. Now, he was walking through a world that had existed beside his own, but had never touched him. Lily walked ahead with an ease that unsettled him, as if she belonged here, as if hardship was familiar territory. She didn't turn back to check if he was still following. She simply assumed he would. For the first time in his life, Arthur Smith was not the one in control. The cold settled deeper into his bones as they passed street vendors hawking cheap electronics and second-hand clothes, small restaurants with dim yellow lighting spilling onto the pavement, their plastic chairs occupied by men hunched over steaming bowls of broth. People moved past them without a second glance, as if Arthur was just another nameless figure in the crowd. It had been years since he had been invisible. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Lily didn't say a word during the walk. She didn't ask questions, didn't fidget. She was completely at ease with silence. Arthur, however, felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He wanted to ask her how long they had lived here, if her mother was okay, if she had ever gone to school, if she had friends. But every question he thought of felt too big, too late. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, Lily finally stopped. Arthur looked up, his gaze settling on the building in front of them. It was a narrow, crumbling apartment complex, the kind he had only ever seen in reports about poverty and housing crises, places that existed in statistics and policy meetings, but never in his own reality. The paint was peeling, the stairwell rusted, and the windows patched with plastic where glass had broken and never been replaced. Arthur felt something press uncomfortably against his ribs. His daughter had grown up here. Lily didn't hesitate. She slipped through the front entrance like it was second nature, leaving Arthur no choice but to follow. Inside, the hallway smelled of damp wood and cooking oil, the flickering overhead light casting long, jagged shadows along the corridor. Arthur had built skyscrapers, launched billion-dollar projects, and shaped entire industries, but now he felt unsteady, like he didn't belong in this space, like the walls themselves could sense his intrusion. They reached the third floor, where Lily stopped in front of a thin wooden door. The number had been scratched off, replaced by a piece of paper taped to the frame, handwritten in ink that had smudged from time and moisture. Arthur's heartbeat quickened. 12 years. He was about to see her after 12 years. Lily raised her small fist and knocked. A shuffle from inside. A pause. Then the door creaked open, and there she was. Grace. She looked older, thinner, her face sharper than he remembered, her hair tied back messily, dark strands falling loose around her jaw. She wasn't wearing makeup. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, the kind exhaustion leaves behind when it's been carried for too long. For a brief moment, she simply stared. Arthur saw the flicker of recognition, the sharp inhale, the widening of her eyes. Then, her expression hardened. Before he could say a word, she slapped him. The sound cracked through the narrow hallway, sharp and final. Arthur barely moved, though the sting spread across his cheek like fire. Grace's hand trembled at her side, but her voice was steady. "You don't get to be shocked," she said, her tone razor-sharp. Arthur didn't answer. What could he say? The hallway was suffocatingly silent, save for the sound of Lily shifting uncomfortably beside them. Grace's chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths, as if she was struggling to contain something. Anger, hurt, something too big to name. And Arthur simply stood there, his pulse loud in his ears, knowing that whatever words he spoke next would not be enough. The sting lingered, not just on Arthur's cheek, but somewhere deeper, somewhere he hadn't thought still capable of feeling pain. Grace stood before him, her body rigid, her breath sharp. The years had left their mark on her, not just in the lines at the corners of her mouth or the weight she had lost, but in the way she held herself, as if every muscle had been braced for this moment. "You have some nerve," she said, her voice low but trembling. "After all this time, after everything, you show up at my door like—" She stopped, shaking her head, the anger rising in her throat. "Like you have the right to be here." Arthur swallowed hard, the words forming but refusing to leave his mouth. He had played out this moment in his mind before, imagined what it would be like to see her again, but nothing had prepared him for this. The sheer force of her hatred, the way her presence alone made him feel like a trespasser in a life that should have been his. He started, but she cut him off. "Why are you here, Arthur?" she snapped, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if trying to hold herself together. "Did you finally get curious? Did you want to see how we survived after you threw us away?" The accusation landed like a blade, slicing clean through his defenses. "I never—" He exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "Grace, I didn't know. I didn't leave you. She laughed, but it was hollow, a sound devoid of humor. "You didn't know." Her gaze burned into him. "Do you have any idea what it was like, raising a child alone, begging for work, scraping by while you sat in your ivory tower, pretending we didn't exist?" "I wasn't pretending." The words left him more forcefully than intended, frustration seeping through. "I looked for you. I searched for years." Grace's jaw clenched. "Then you didn't try hard enough." Arthur opened his mouth, then shut it. He had no argument. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. From somewhere behind a closed door, a television murmured, a muffled sitcom laugh track echoing down the hall. Arthur felt the weight of eyes on them. The neighbors had started watching. A door creaked open a few feet away. A woman in a faded housecoat peeked out, her gaze flickering between Grace and Arthur before settling on Lily. "You okay, hun?" Lily shifted on her feet, her usual confidence wavering. Yeah, we're fine, Mrs. Ortega." The woman didn't look convinced. Her gaze lingered on Arthur before she finally retreated, the door shutting with a soft thud. Arthur turned back to Grace, his voice lower now, measured. "I swear to you, I never abandoned you. I don't know what happened, but I tried." "You don't know?" Grace let out a sharp breath, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're really standing there, looking me in the eye, telling me you don't know?" Arthur stayed silent, waiting. "You don't get to play the victim, Arthur," she said, her voice quieter but no less sharp. "I didn't disappear. I was thrown out. Someone made sure I was erased from your life." The words hit him like a slow-burning realization, sinking deep into his chest. Thrown out. Erased. Who? His voice was barely above a whisper. Grace let out a bitter laugh, but before she could answer, she turned her head toward Lily, who had been watching the exchange with a silent intensity, her fingers gripping the hem of her jacket. "Why did you bring him here?" Grace asked, her voice softer now, but still carrying the weight of something breaking. Lily hesitated. For the first time, she looked unsure. Arthur saw the way her gaze flickered between them, how she swallowed hard before answering. She looked down at her shoes. "I just thought he should know." Grace exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temples. "Lily, we don't need him." Lily flinched at the words but said nothing. The tension curled around them like a thick fog, suffocating and unmoving. Arthur took a slow step forward. "Grace, please, let me explain. Let me fix this." Her expression hardened again in an instant. "You don't fix 12 years of suffering with an apology, Arthur." Before he could speak again, she reached for the door. Arthur felt the moment slipping away, felt the walls closing in, felt the past digging its claws into his skin and holding him there. The door slammed shut. Lily hesitated for just a second, just long enough for Arthur to see the uncertainty in her face, the part of her that wasn't sure which side of the door she wanted to be on. Then, without looking at him, she turned and followed her mother inside. Arthur stood there, staring at the worn wood, at the chipped paint, at the tiny gap beneath the door that separated him from everything he had lost. The hallway felt unbearably quiet. The world outside moved on, unchanged, indifferent to the wreckage of his past, unraveling at his feet. After a long moment, he turned and walked away. Arthur sat in the back of his car, the city lights blurring past him, but his mind was somewhere else. The faint murmurs of his assistant drifted through the space, but he barely heard her. "Sir, the board meeting has been moved to..." He stared out the window. "Mr. Smith." The words barely registered. 12 years. He had spent 12 years searching, and now, standing at the edge of the truth, he realized something chilling. He had never even been looking in the right place. The night stretched long, the city moving at its usual restless pace, but inside the black sedan parked across the street from Grace's apartment, Arthur Smith sat in silence. The dashboard lights cast a dim glow over his hands, fingers interlaced as he stared at the window 3 stories up. A faint yellow light glowed behind the tattered curtains, the only proof that his daughter, his child, was inside. 12 years. 12 years of nothing. Now, all he had was the weight of her words still hanging in the air, the echo of Grace's fury still burning on his skin. Outside, a man shuffled past, shoulders hunched against the cold, a plastic grocery bag swinging at his side. Across the street, a woman locked up a corner store, pausing to adjust her scarf before disappearing into the night. Arthur should have left. There was nothing here for him. Grace had made that clear. And yet, he stayed. The first thing Lily learned as a child was how to make herself small. Small when her mother got tired, small when there wasn't enough food, small when the landlord banged on the door, demanding rent they didn't have. She learned how to stretch a meal, how to pretend she wasn't hungry when her mother placed the last piece of bread on her plate. She learned how to sleep with a jacket as a blanket, how to press herself into the corner of a too small bed so her mother had more space. She learned how to smile through it. When winter came, she learned how to press her hands against the vents of the corner laundromat, stealing warmth before the owner chased her away. She knew which restaurants threw out food in clean bags, which street vendors gave free bread if she looked hungry enough. She learned to run when men looked at her too long. She learned to never ask for more than what was given, and she learned, most of all, to hate the man on the screen. Her mother never spoke of him at first, not by name, not in stories. But Lily saw the way she clenched her jaw when his face flickered across the television, the way her grip tightened on whatever she was holding. She saw the tears once, a quiet, broken sound in the dark. Her mother curled on her side, Lily too afraid to move. So she decided then she would hate him enough for both of them. But now, watching him standing in that hallway, something inside her wavered, and she hated that too. By morning, Arthur had barely slept. The street was quieter now, the weight of dawn settling over the buildings. He watched as the apartment door creaked open and Grace stepped out, Lily trailing behind her. For a moment, Arthur didn't move. Grace's hair was tied back haphazardly, her coat pulled tightly around her frame. She carried herself with the same stiff determination as the night before, her steps precise, her gaze fixed ahead. But Lily laughed at something, her voice light, unguarded. Another girl walked beside her, nudging her playfully, and for the first time, Arthur saw the child beneath the weight she carried. He had missed this. All of it. Grace's head turned sharply, her eyes locking onto the black car. Her expression darkened. Arthur barely had time to brace before she turned fully, marching toward the vehicle. Lily hesitated, a silent conflict flickering in her gaze before she followed. Grace didn't knock on the window. She pounded. Arthur rolled it down slowly. "You've got to be kidding me," she hissed, her breath visible in the cold morning air. "You're stalking us now." Arthur held her gaze. "I needed to see—" "You don't get to watch from the shadows, Arthur," she snapped. "You lost that right 12 years ago." He exhaled, gripping the steering wheel, grounding himself. He couldn't lose his temper. Not now. "I didn't know," he said carefully. "I didn't know she existed." Grace let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "And what? You expect that to excuse you?" "No," he admitted. "But it's the truth." Grace shook her head, her exhaustion bleeding through the cracks of her anger. "Stay away from her." And with that, she turned, her coat whipping around her as she walked off, Lily trailing behind, but casting one last look at Arthur before disappearing into the morning crowd. Arthur didn't go back to the office. Instead, he went to the one place he should have gone years ago. The office was smaller than he remembered, tucked away on the east side of the city. A thin man in his 60s sat behind a desk, cluttered with papers, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. The moment he looked up, recognition flickered across his face. "Smith," the man, Daniel Turner, greeted, setting his pen down. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Arthur didn't bother with pleasantries. 12 years ago, I hired you to find someone." Turner leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Yeah, and I told you, she disappeared without a trace." Arthur's jaw tightened. She didn't disappear. She was erased. Silence stretched between them, heavy, unspoken. Turner sighed, rubbing his temple. I figured something was off. Every lead went cold too fast. Every source dried up before I could reach them. It was like someone was covering her tracks in real time. Arthur felt his hands curl into fists. Who had that kind of power? Turner hesitated. I'm not sure, but I think they'll be the one directly related to you, he said. I will find out soon. Arthur closed his eyes. This wasn't just about lost time anymore. This was war. The first package arrived 2 days later. A brown paper bag left outside their apartment door. Neatly packed inside were groceries, fresh fruit, bread, canned goods, and a bag of rice that was heavier than anything Grace had been able to afford in months. Grace knew immediately who had sent it. She stared at the bag for a long moment, hands curled into fists at her sides. Then, without hesitation, she picked it up and dumped everything into the trash. Lily saw. She didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, her small hands gripping the frame. Her mother's anger scared her sometimes, not because it was ever turned on her, but because it burned too hot, too long, until it consumed everything in its path. That night, Lily didn't ask about the food, but the next day, when another bag appeared, this time tucked inside her school bag, she didn't tell her mother. Instead, she kept it. Arthur never saw Grace throw the food away, but he suspected she would. That didn't stop him. Every morning, deliveries were made. Groceries, school supplies, warm clothes. Not enough to overwhelm, just enough to make things easier. He never attached his name to anything, but Grace knew. The first time she found cash tucked inside Lily's backpack, she nearly tore the apartment apart in fury. "Did you take this from him?" Lily looked at the wrinkled bills in her hands. $20. Not enough to change their lives, but enough to help. She shook her head. It was just there. Grace's expression hardened. She grabbed the money and tossed it out the window. Lily watched it flutter away. Later that night, she sat on the fire escape, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the city stretching below. She thought about all the times they had gone to bed hungry, the times her mother had gone without eating, just so Lily could have a little more. She thought about what it would feel like to not always be struggling, and she hated herself for thinking it. Arthur noticed small changes. Lily's coat was still too thin for the season, but she started wearing the new gloves he had sent. The school supplies he had delivered were being used. The groceries were still being thrown out, but the bread was disappearing. Grace was fighting him, but Lily was starting to bend. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was a crack in the wall. One afternoon, Grace came home to find Lily sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a carton of milk in front of her. She was just staring. "What's wrong?" Grace asked, dropping her bag by the door. Lily didn't look up. "Did you know the milk expires slower when it's not from the discount store?" Grace froze. It was such a small thing, something a child shouldn't have even noticed. But Lily had always noticed. A lump formed in Grace's throat. She reached for the carton, fingers hovering over it. "Did he send this?" Lily nodded. For a long time, Grace said nothing. The room was quiet, save for the sound of distant traffic outside the window. Then, she grabbed the milk, poured it down the sink, and threw the carton away. Lily watched in silence. Later that night, she lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The sound of her mother moving around in the kitchen reached her ears. The faint shuffle of things being rearranged, the empty space where food should have been. And Lily made a decision. Arthur had been waiting for something. He didn't know what, maybe a sign, maybe a chance. He wasn't expecting the phone call. Lily's voice was quiet, hesitant. "Can you meet me after school tomorrow?" Arthur sat up, heart hammering. "Of course. Where?" she told him. And then she hung up. Lily didn't know why she had done it. All she knew was that the idea of going home to nothing again, of watching her mother fight against something that could have helped them, was too much. So when she met Arthur outside her school, she accepted the bag of food he offered. She expected it to feel wrong. It didn't. She expected to feel guilty. She did. But she took it anyway. Grace didn't notice at first. Then, little by little, things changed. Lily wasn't as tired. She had more energy. She started looking forward to lunch at school because she had something real to eat. Then one day, Lily came home wearing new shoes. Grace stared at them. "Where did you get those?" Lily hesitated. "A friend gave them to me." It wasn't a complete lie. Grace didn't believe her, but she didn't press. She just turned away and said, "Take them off before you come inside." Arthur knew it wasn't enough. Groceries weren't enough. School supplies weren't enough. Money wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed a home. It took weeks. Finding the right place. Making sure it wasn't obvious he had arranged it. Securing everything in a way that Grace wouldn't be able to refuse outright. Then, one day, it was done. A clean apartment. A real home. No leaks. No broken windows. A school nearby. Arthur had the lease signed and left the keys for them. Grace nearly threw them back in his face, but then Lily saw the place. And for the first time, Lily looked like a child, not someone constantly bracing for disappointment. She ran through the rooms, touching everything, her eyes wide, her face open in a way that Grace hadn't seen in years. And Grace caved. She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't acknowledge Arthur as she stood in the doorway, watching Lily press her hands against the clean glass of the window, looking out at the city like she belonged to it now. Instead, she simply stepped aside. For the first time, Arthur was allowed inside, even if it was just to carry boxes. The office was colder than Arthur remembered. It was a relic from a past life, tucked away in the same corner of the city where he had last searched for Grace, where he had last held on to hope before it slipped through his fingers. Daniel Turner sat across from him, the old detective's fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the worn wooden desk. Arthur had spent years living with unanswered questions. He wasn't ready for what came next. "You're sure about this?" Arthur's voice was even, but his grip on the chair's arm tightened. Turner slid the folder toward him. "I double-checked everything. Surveillance footage from 12 years ago, gone. Every paper trail wiped. Private investigators either paid off or warned away." He paused. "Whoever did this wasn't just trying to make her disappear. They wanted to make sure you never found her." Arthur stared at the file. Turner leaned back, sighing. "All roads lead back to one person." Arthur turned the folder over, eyes landing on the name. Rachel Smith. His breath caught. The name sat there, plain as day, a wound he had never seen coming. "No," Arthur said, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "Not Rachel." Turner exhaled through his nose. "I had a hard time believing it too, but it makes sense, doesn't it? Who else had the power? Who else had access to your life, your business, and enough pull to erase someone from existence?" Arthur's stomach twisted. Rachel, his own sister. Rachel, who had stood beside him at their mother's funeral, hand in his, whispering that they only had each other now. Rachel, who had managed his affairs when he was drowning in work, who had been his most trusted confidant. Rachel, who had looked him in the eye for 12 years while knowing exactly where Grace had been. Arthur pressed a hand to his forehead, trying to steady himself, but his pulse roared in his ears. "You really didn't suspect?" Turner asked, though his voice held no judgment. Arthur let out a hollow laugh. "Not for a second." That was the worst part. He had trusted Rachel implicitly. He had never questioned her loyalty, never once thought she could be capable of something like this. Turner watched him carefully. "What do you want to do now?" Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't, because he didn't know what to do with this truth. This realization that the person he had loved and trusted most had been the one to steal 12 years of his life, 12 years of his daughter's life. The rage built slow, a simmering heat in his chest. This wasn't just about lost time. This was betrayal. Across the city, Grace sat in the apartment that wasn't hers, watching Lily scribble on a piece of paper at the kitchen table. The apartment was clean, warm, filled with things they hadn't had before. A fridge that worked, a heater that didn't sputter out in the middle of the night, a bathroom with tiles that weren't cracked. She should have hated it. She should have thrown the keys back in his face. But then she had seen Lily's face, the way her daughter had lit up when she saw the space, the way she had let herself hope for once, and Grace hadn't been able to take that away from her. She shifted in her chair, rubbing at her temples. For 12 years, she had believed one thing, that Arthur Smith had abandoned her, that he had walked away without looking back. But now, there was a crack in that certainty. She could still see the shock in his eyes when she had told him she had been erased, the genuine confusion, the anger that hadn't been for her, but for something he didn't understand yet. And the worst part, for the first time in 12 years, she wasn't sure if she had hated the right person. She closed her eyes. Could she have been wrong? Had she wasted years despising a man who had never even known the truth? A part of her wanted to believe it. Another part of her was terrified too. Because if she had been wrong, if Arthur really hadn't known, then what had all those years of suffering been for? And who had taken everything from her? Arthur drove back to his penthouse in silence. The city blurred outside the windows, but his mind was stuck in the past, unraveling every moment with Rachel, replaying every conversation, every reassurance she had given him over the years. "I'm sorry, Arthur. There's no trace of her. Maybe she didn't want to be found. You need to let it go. Move on. If she had wanted to be with you, she would have been." Lies. All of them. He stepped into his apartment, the cold sterility of the space glaring in its emptiness. For years, he had thought of this place as a refuge. Now, it felt like a prison. He picked up his phone, fingers tightening around it. Rachel. She had known. And she had stood there, at every family event, at every board meeting, smiling like she hadn't stolen his entire life from him. Arthur exhaled, the anger rolling through him in waves. He had spent 12 years searching for the wrong answers. Now, he finally had the right one, and soon Rachel would have to answer for it. The elevator ride to Rachel's office felt longer than usual, though it took only seconds. Arthur stood rigid, his jaw locked, his hands clenched at his sides as the numbers above the doors blinked in succession. He could feel the pulse in his throat, his breathing controlled but sharp. The sterile glow of the office lights reflected on the steel panels, casting a cold, unfeeling sheen across his face. Then, the doors slid open. Rachel's assistant barely had time to look up before Arthur strode past her, ignoring her startled protest. "Mr. Smith, she's in a meeting." Not anymore. Arthur slammed open the door to his sister's office. Rachel sat behind her desk, poised, calm, like she had been expecting him. The executive across from her, a well-dressed man in his 50s, froze mid-sentence. "Leave," Arthur ordered. The man hesitated. Rachel didn't. "We'll continue this later, Michael." Her voice was smooth, unaffected. The man glanced between them, sensing the storm brewing, then grabbed his briefcase and exited. Arthur shut the door behind him, the click loud in the silence that followed. Rachel leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly over the polished wood. "I assume you found out," she said, no surprise in her tone. Arthur's breathing was slow, measured, but his hands itched to slam against the desk, to shake the answers out of her. "You took her away from me." His voice was low, almost deadly. Rachel didn't flinch. "I protected you." Arthur let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh. "Protected me?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one might examine a wounded animal, You don't see it now, but I did what had to be done. By erasing my daughter." His voice rose, anger cracking through the control he was barely holding on to. "By making Grace think I abandoned her. By making sure I never found them." Rachel sighed, her fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "Sit down, Arthur." "I'm not sitting." Rachel exhaled through her nose, then rose slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer. "I won't apologize, and I won't pretend I regret it." Arthur stepped closer. "Then tell me why." His sister looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't indifference. It was conviction. "You really don't understand, do you?" Her voice softened, almost pitying. "Mother died from heartbreak, Arthur. Not just from illness. She died because father couldn't stay loyal to her, because he humiliated her. And when she saw him with that woman who wasn't even worthy of cleaning our floors, it broke her." Arthur's breath caught, but Rachel kept going. "I was the one who found her, you know." Her voice was distant now, like she was speaking through time. She was sitting in her room, staring at nothing, just gone. Her body was still alive, but she had already left us. Arthur remembered that day. Their mother had always been poised, elegant, in control. Until she wasn't. Until she had faded before their eyes. "Do you know what her last words to me were?" Rachel whispered. "She said, 'Don't let it happen again.'" Arthur swallowed hard. Rachel's gaze sharpened. "So, I didn't." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. "That's what this was." Arthur's voice was hoarse. "You thought I was becoming him." Rachel lifted her chin. "You were blinded by love, Arthur. I wasn't going to stand by and let another woman, a nobody, take everything from you, from our family." "She wasn't a nobody," Arthur said, voice thick with something between rage and grief. "She was everything to me." Rachel's expression didn't waver. "You wouldn't have listened back then," she said. "You would have chosen her over everything, over the company, over your legacy, over me." Arthur shook his head in disbelief. "So, you decided for me?" "You were too emotional to make the right choice," Rachel said simply. "I made it for you." Arthur felt something inside him crack wide open. 12 years. 12 years he had spent searching, mourning, believing Grace had left him by choice. And Rachel had been the one to make that decision. "Did you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. Rachel hesitated, and that was all the answer he needed. Arthur turned away, his body vibrating with fury. He couldn't even look at her. "Arthur," Rachel said, her voice softer now, "you have your business, your power, your reputation. You're better off." He let out a slow, trembling breath. "Do you even hear yourself?" He turned back, his eyes burning. "You think you saved me, but you ruined everything." Rachel didn't move, didn't blink. Arthur stepped toward the door. He could barely see straight, the betrayal suffocating, suffusing every thought. But before he left, he said the one thing he knew would finally get through to her. "I have a daughter," he said, voice raw, "and you stole her from me." For the first time, Rachel's mask slipped. Arthur saw it, the crack in her armor. She hadn't thought about Lily. She had been so focused on protecting Arthur, on erasing Grace, that she had never considered the life she was destroying in the process. Arthur saw the realization hit her like a slow, twisting knife. He held her gaze for a long, unbearable moment. Then, without another word, he walked out. Rachel didn't stop him. She didn't say a word, because for the first time in her life, she had nothing left to say. The scent of simmering soup filled the small apartment, mingling with the crisp evening air seeping through the slightly cracked window. The gentle sound of a knife against the cutting board echoed in the quiet space as Grace stood at the counter, her hands moving mechanically as she chopped vegetables. For years, she had learned to live without thinking too much, without hoping for more. Cooking was just another necessity, another task, in a long list of things she had to do to keep Lily fed, to keep their lives stitched together. But tonight, the weight in her chest felt different. Less like exhaustion, more like hesitation. She had spent the past few days thinking, replaying moments in her head, re-examining her anger, her grief, and her certainty. And it was beginning to feel unsteady. She gripped the knife tighter. The sound of footsteps in the hall was followed by a knock. A firm, deliberate knock. She didn't need to check to know who it was. She wasn't ready. But Lily had already darted toward the door, her small hands fumbling with the lock before swinging it open. Arthur stood there. He looked different. Not the billionaire, not the untouchable figure she had seen on magazine covers. He looked like a man who had lost something, a man still trying to understand how it had been taken from him. Before Grace could say anything, Lily launched herself forward, wrapping her arms around him. Arthur froze for a moment before he held her tightly, his eyes shutting, his face buried in her hair. Grace felt something crack in her chest. For 12 years, she had kept them separate. Arthur in her past. Lily is in her present. But now they were standing in the same space, and she couldn't breathe. Arthur finally looked up. His eyes found hers, and Grace saw it. Something raw, something broken. He stepped inside without asking, crossing the space between them before she could stop him. And then he pulled her into his arms. Grace stiffened, her hands pressed against his chest as if to push him away. But he was shaking. His breath was unsteady, his grip firm but desperate, as if he needed this more than he wanted to admit. For a moment, she fought it, the instinct to hold herself together, to keep the anger burning because it was easier than whatever this was. But then she heard it. A shuddered breath, a quiet exhale that wasn't quite a sob, but wasn't far from one. "I'm sorry. Sorry for not being able to protect you two from Rachel, family honor, prejudices, and my weakness. I'm a stupid rich guy who took 12 years to find the answer. Where do I start to make up for and make amends?" Arthur was crying, the words gritted into his voice like a punishment. And Grace broke. 12 years of pain, of loneliness, of exhaustion, it all came crashing down in an instant. She sank against him, her hands clutching the fabric of his coat as the first tear slipped down her cheek. Neither of them spoke anymore. They just stood there, holding on to each other, grieving for everything they had lost. Lily sat curled up in the armchair, watching them in silence. She had never seen her mother cry. Not like this. She had never seen Arthur look so human, so undone. For a long time she had hated the idea of him, hated what she thought he had done. But now, she didn't know anymore. She hugged her knees to her chest, her small fingers curling into the fabric of her jeans. Maybe, just maybe, she had hated the wrong person. Arthur pulled back first, just enough to see her face, her tear-streaked cheeks, the war still waging in her eyes. He cupped her face gently, as if he was afraid she might disappear again. "She took you from me." His voice was hoarse. "Rachel took you away." Grace let out a trembling breath. "I know," she whispered. Arthur closed his eyes. It didn't erase everything. It didn't fix the years they had lost. But in this moment, they weren't enemies anymore. They were just two people who had been broken by the same lie. And for the first time in 12 years, they weren't alone in their grief. Rachel sat alone in her office, the dim glow of her desk lamp illuminating the polished surface of the mahogany table. The city lights sprawled beneath her window, a vast kingdom she had helped Arthur build, a kingdom she no longer belonged to. Her fingers hovered over a stack of old photographs, their edges worn from years spent tucked away in a drawer she never opened. A picture of her and Arthur as children, their mother smiling softly behind them. A picture of Arthur with Grace, the only one she had ever let herself keep. A moment before everything changed. Rachel exhaled, rubbing her temple. For the first time in 12 years, she didn't feel certain. She had spent over a decade believing she had done the right thing, that she had protected Arthur, safeguarded his legacy, saved him from a mistake. But then, she had seen him, broken, empty. She had seen the way he looked at that little girl, the daughter he should have known. Rachel closed her eyes, her mother's voice echoing from the past. Don't let it happen again. But had she prevented history from repeating, or had she become the villain in it? She stood abruptly, reaching for her phone. Find me Grace's address, she said, her voice steady, even as her fingers trembled. Her assistant hesitated on the other end of the line. Mrs. Smith, may I ask why? Rachel almost didn't know how to answer. For years, she had erased Grace from existence. Now, she was asking to find her. I just need it, she said, tonight. The line clicked dead. Rachel stared at the skyline, her reflection barely recognizable in the glass. She had spent her whole life fighting for control. But what had she really won? The rain fell in thin, quiet sheets against the city skyline, blurring the golden glow of the streetlights. Rachel stood alone, watching from across the street as Arthur stepped out of Grace's apartment building, his coat draped over Lily's small shoulders. For the first time in years, he looked at peace, not entirely whole, but healing. She had thought she would feel relief. Seeing him like this, seeing him safe, still standing after everything she had done to protect him. But all she felt was the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. She had convinced herself for years that she had been right, that Arthur needed her to make the hard decisions, that he would have thrown his entire legacy away if she hadn't intervened. She had told herself that taking Grace out of his life was an act of love. But as she watched him now, a father holding onto his daughter, a man rebuilding a love he had been robbed of, Rachel understood the truth. She hadn't protected him. She had stolen from him, stolen his family, stolen his happiness. And for what? To preserve a legacy that had never been hers to control? To uphold the illusion of family honor when their family had been broken long before Grace ever entered the picture? She had told herself she was different from their father, but standing there, watching Arthur, a man who had found his way back despite everything, she realized she had been exactly like him. The next morning, Arthur arrived at his office to find an envelope waiting for him. No name, no return address, just a single sheet of paper inside. I resigned from my position at Smith Enterprises, effective immediately. I have transferred my shares back to you. No explanation, no plea for forgiveness, just a signature at the bottom, Rachel. Arthur let the paper slip from his fingers, exhaling slowly. This was her goodbye. She wasn't asking for absolution. She was leaving, walking away from everything she had built, everything she had clung to. Arthur should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt empty. Because despite everything, Rachel had been his sister, his closest confidant. And now, she was gone. Rachel's new life started in a town that didn't know her name. The modest home she moved into had creaky floors and a draft in the winter. The neighbors were friendly but kept their distance, sensing something in her that wasn't ready to be known. She worked quietly, volunteering at a local shelter, handing out food to struggling families. At first it had felt foreign, this act of giving without expecting control in return. But then she met a woman who reminded her of Grace. A mother, exhausted, holding onto her child's hand as if it were the only thing tethering her to the world. And Rachel finally understood. She had been so afraid of history repeating itself that she had become the thing she feared most. So, she stayed. She didn't seek redemption, but she hoped one day to deserve it. And that would have to be enough. The new house stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, where the city's noise faded into something softer, something that felt closer to peace. It wasn't extravagant. wasn't the cold, towering structures Arthur was used to. It was warm, with wide windows that let in the afternoon sun and a small garden out front, nothing like the penthouses and high-rise buildings he had called home. And yet, this place felt more real than anything he had ever owned. Arthur stood outside, hands in his coat pockets, watching Grace and Lily step inside first. He still didn't know how to exist here, in this version of his life, where he had a daughter who looked at him with something other than suspicion, where Grace no longer met his presence with walls built from old wounds. He had lost 12 years. He didn't know if he could ever make up for them. But today, they were here. And that was something. Inside, Grace moved slowly, trailing her fingers over the wooden kitchen counters, the bookshelves that still needed filling, the staircase leading up to rooms she never thought they would have. This was Arthur's doing. She had tried to fight it, had told him she didn't need charity. But when Lily had seen the house, when she had run through the empty hallways, laughing, spinning in the kind of joy Grace had rarely seen from her, she had given in. Not for herself, for Lily. She stood near the window now, watching Arthur as he lingered outside, unmoving. She knew that hesitation, knew what it was to stand on the edge of something new and not know if you were allowed to step forward. A deep breath steadied her. Then she spoke. "You're allowed to come in, you know." Arthur looked up. For a long moment, he just watched her, as if trying to decipher whether there was hesitation in her voice, whether there was still a part of her that wanted to keep him out. Then, finally, he stepped inside. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't built from anger or old scars. It was something else, a space they were both standing in, uncertain but not unwilling. Arthur cleared his throat, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't know where to start," he admitted. "I don't know how to fix this." Grace exhaled, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. She could tell him that there was no fixing something like this, that some things simply couldn't be undone. But then she looked at him, really looked at him. This wasn't the same man from 12 years ago. The man in front of her wasn't untouchable anymore, wasn't distant. For the first time, he was just Arthur. And maybe that was enough. "I don't want you to fix it," she said finally. "I just want you to try." Arthur let out a slow breath. "I can do that," he said. Lily sat on the stairs, listening. She had spent years wondering what her life would have been like if Arthur had been there. Now, she wasn't sure what to do with the reality of him staying. She had spent so much time holding on to the version of him she had been told about, the man who had abandoned them. But this Arthur wasn't that man. She wasn't sure who he was yet, but for the first time, she wanted to find out. Lily took a slow breath, then stepped forward. Arthur turned toward her, eyes soft, waiting. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached for his hand. Arthur stilled. He didn't move, didn't squeeze too tightly, didn't do anything to scare her away. But his entire world shifted. A silent gesture, a tiny, tentative trust. Arthur felt something in his chest loosen, soften, something that had been locked away for far too long. He had spent years building empires, fortunes, legacies. But this moment, this was the only thing that had ever made him feel whole. He wrapped his fingers gently around hers. For the first time in 12 years, he wasn't reaching for something that was already gone. He was holding on to something real. The past would always exist, but so would the future, and this time, he wouldn't lose it. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.